Prior to the Switch, Nintendo somehow managed to have both their best-selling console, the Wii, and worst-selling console, the Wii U, released adjacent to one another. Ubisoft, known for Rayman, Prince of Persia, Splinter Cell, Assassin's Creed, and much more, were interested in having a piece of that proverbial Nintendo pie. Likely tempted by the ever-increasing hype for the release of Nintendo's new console, the Wii, and maybe a dash of respect for Nintendo's legacy, Ubisoft created an exclusive game just for the launch of the system. Following the massive success that was the Wii, it was no surprise that Ubisoft then wanted to place its bets on its successor, the Wii U, with another new game built exclusively for the console. Unfortunately, the tale of the Wii U is a much sadder one, and for the Switch's launch, well, let's just say they played it safe this time around. What we were left with is two very unique games not developed by Nintendo for two very unique Nintendo consoles. In part 1 of this two-parter, we're going to look at the first game trying to capitalize on the game changer that was the Wii. Let's go back in time. It's November 2006. Nintendo is about to launch the much anticipated Wii. I'm 15 years old and I'm pumped! At this point in my life, I'm more involved with video games as an industry outside of just playing them. This was going to be my fourth console, and the first one I was going to buy on launch day with my own money. When you grow up in a low-income household, you start buying your own shit at a pretty young age. Nothing in my life up until this point has given me as much anticipation and hype as the launch of the Wii. It was the perfect recipe of age, curiosity, and independence. Why was I so excited? For those of you too young to have lived it, or too old to understand, quick recap of the Wii's history. The GameCube, great, but to Nintendo, it was okay. There was no clear advantage to it over its contemporaries, the Xbox, and the goldmine that was the PlayStation 2. In terms of hardware, sure there are differences you can point to, but all three of these consoles can play the same games if needed. Nintendo, and specifically Nintendo president at the time, Satoru Iwata, decided to make the bold move of abandoning the current race of horsepower, the precedent set in the industry for the last 20 years. Instead, Iwata announced he would adopt the Blue Ocean strategy. At the time, we didn't know quite what this meant as it pertained to video game consoles. What it became was Nintendo unlocking the casual market, now dominated by mobile users all over the world. Back then, the only people playing games were self-proclaimed gamers. Mom and dad, your bus driver, your librarian. They weren't playing enough video games for Nintendo's liking. And in them, Nintendo saw a vine leading to a treasure trove of coins. The first step into this market was the portable Nintendo DS. With its easy to understand touch controls, bus driver Mel, she loved it, as did the built-in hardcore crowd, because there's always going to be the Nintendo faithful. So the next logical step was the home console. By this point, I was coming into my own as a Nintendo quote-unquote fanboy. My first console was an SNES, followed by a PlayStation 1, and lastly, a Nintendo GameCube. Throughout my time with the GameCube, I came to understand more that those Nintendo-developed games and hardware had a certain charm and polish to them unseen anywhere else in the medium. If you've always played Nintendo games, you know what I mean. It's kind of hard to put into words. So it was safe to say that the mystery surrounding Nintendo's next-gen hardware had my attention, no matter what it was going to be. The first real mention of it came in 2004. And what did Iwata call it? The goddamn revolution. Of course, at this point, my teenage mind ran wild of speculation. I could only imagine the best of the best console, something that'll immerse me like never before. By 2005, we knew what the DS was, so the revolution was all but guaranteed to be out of left field. E3 2005, we see the physical representation of the revolution. It's tiny, but sure is sleek. Iwata did hint in 2004 that this next console was basically not going to be any kind of powerhouse. But you have to remember, at 13 years old, I was all in on being a fanboy, and there was zero tolerance in my head for any negative skepticism. This little console, the size of 3 stacked DVD cases,
about the size of 3 standard DVD cases.
As far as I was concerned, was going to be a small nuclear reactor powering my video game dreams.
When you turn on Revolution and see the graphics, you will say, wow.
That misleading quote triggered my teenage self to ascend to Super Saiyan levels of hype. Fast forward some months to the Tokyo Game Show 2005. Up until then, much of the console's functionality has been shrouded in mystery and speculation. But finally, we get this.
I was standing there like this.
In order to understand how absolutely mental this was, you have to put yourself in 2005. Motion controls are ubiquitous today. Everything has them. Your phone, PS4 controller, PS5 controller, your watch, your frying pan. But in 2005, motion-controlled anything was not mainstream and considered future tech, depicted more often in science fiction than real-world applications. For me, this was going to give me the kind of virtual reality experience I've always wanted. Prior to this, I had played some motion-enabled games at Palladium, basically a big arcade. At this point, I didn't care whether the graphics were cutting edge or not, I just wanted to play with those controllers. Jump ahead to E3 2006, our first look at real games running and being played on the hardware. And during this sizzle, we get our first peek at Redsteel. Now this is the kind of game I want to play with these controllers. This year, the actual unit is on the show floor, and it's fair to say that everyone else shared my enthusiasm and curiosity about the Wii. Everyone wanted to try it. Let me also say that Nintendo's E3 2006 was one of my all-time favorites. You can call it nostalgia, but the stage and live orchestra, plus the blowout of the Wii reveal and games, made for a presentation unmatched by any other Nintendo would put on going forward. The Wii launched, it was a hit, thanks in part to Wii Sports. The rest we all know. And so here we are, a chilly November 2006, sitting in my basement in front of my CRT television, Wii remote in hand, ready to play Redsteel. Right after I finished Twilight Princess first. At this point, I had read the reviews. Yes, read them, not just scrolled to the score. The reviews were mediocre at best, and I wanted to know why. As it turns out, most of the negativity came from the controls, the one thing I was most looking forward to. But I refused to believe it was as cumbersome as was described in those reviews. Besides, at this point, I was just way too damn curious to find out for myself how it felt to control a shooter with motion controls. So let's open a game. Oh my goodness, look at the disc, it's black! That's so cool already. Side note, I'm not sure how to quite explain it, but being a Nintendo fan, there is something strangely appealing about more mature games developed just for a Nintendo console. I think it's the rare combination of mature themes / third-party developed / exclusive to Nintendo that makes it like sighting some rare bird in the wild. You know you're in for something different. Alright, putting the friggin' game in. Cool menu. Kinda cheap looking, but you can click and drag things into this billboard and get a little animation for each option. Though, the actual options here are pretty seldom. So let's talk about the game. For this video, I replayed the entire game from start to finish. And as much as I could discuss each level in depth, let's go over the main talking points. Firstly, the cutscenes, even for its time, are painfully low budget.
Made your job easier not to be friends with the client. And here you are, about to meet my dad and tell him you want to marry.
Artwork in separate layers with simple animations. You only encounter one of these at the beginning and sometimes at the end of each level, though some of the story beats do play out in-game. So, after admiring the graphics,
You will say, wow.
and having the game's plot set up,
Please wait here. What the hell?
time to get my gun. To do that, you gotta flip this table by flicking the nunchuck upward. Feels pretty cool at first. This action is used throughout the game in order to provide you some cover, although strangely it only applies to the odd table. This is truly the moment I've been waiting to feel in this game. How does it feel to wield a weapon with motion controls? And while pointing the gun around at first feels great, with a natural position of the B button under your index finger emulating a gun trigger, you'll quickly start to see what those reviews and many other players took issue with: turning and overall movement. Moving forward, backward, and strafing with the analog stick on a nunchuck serves its purpose and makes sense. No different than a left analog stick on any other contemporary controller with an FPS game. But turning, looking up or down is a real struggle, and can be enough to turn anyone off the game after a few minutes of play, even with the aiming sensitivity turned up to high. See, this is before first-person shooters were properly figured out on the Wii. The problem is the bounding box. That is, the boundary the reticle needs to hit before the camera starts to turn. Since this bounding box is so large and close to the edges of the screen, it means you need to point all the way close to the edge of the screen in order to look around. This is in contrast to any other FPS where the reticle is locked to the center of the screen and follows all camera movement. Given the way the infrared sensor on the Wii Remote works as a pointing device and how unsteady the human hand naturally is, this would be unlikely to work or feel right. However, there is a sweet spot where the bounding box can be small enough to allow pointer controls, while still allowing you to turn quickly when traversing through the world or reacting to enemies in a firefight. Unfortunately, I think Ubisoft made a bit too much of a compromise when considering overall comfort. This is a new style of control after all. In the end, the solution, great if everything is right in front of me, makes for a rather frustrating experience otherwise. You would think the game would be developed with these compromised controls in mind, placing most enemies in front of you as a simple shooting gallery, but that is most definitely not the case throughout the game. Later shooters on the Wii would get this control method right by not only having a smaller bounding box and faster sensitivity, but in some cases even allowing the user to adjust a bounding box to whichever size they find right for them. The Conduit in particular has an abundance of options. But for now, we're going to struggle with what we got here. Even upon first playing Redsteel, while I could tell then that these controls were a struggle to work with, my enthusiasm for the motion gimmicks alone were enough to delude myself into enjoying the game. And really, if you're having fun, that's all that matters. Watching the gameplay here, you can probably sense my struggle, though as I progress I get better at handling it. I will say that these first few opening levels in particular are quite rough to play through. You would think, like most games, the designers would try and capture the player's attention in the opening minutes, but unfortunately, the more ambitious and creative sections don't present themselves until later. More on that soon. This opening sequence is bland, unimaginative, frustrating, and while the entire game is quite framey, at times giving me flashbacks to GoldenEye on the N64, this first stage is consistently bad. But at the time, I was willing to see it through. As mentioned, I was really thrilled by the technology alone, even if not optimized at its best. Here's one mechanic that sort of alleviates the controls. I prefer to play most of the game just pointing and shooting as so. I find the game more immersive that way. But optionally, you can hold the A button to lightly lock on to enemies. This helps sometimes, especially if the enemies are quite far. Moving the remote closer to the screen zooms in, which can feel quite cumbersome. At times, trying to navigate the cursor while locked on can only disorient yourself more, especially when using the sniper rifle. Don't even bother, you'll end up dying half the time you're trying to orient yourself. Best off firing from the hip. I will say that for the most part, when it works, shooting does feel good. Nailing an instant kill headshot gives this satisfying squish sound.
Last floor for you!
Probably the most violent thing in the game, given there isn't an ounce of blood. Another positive is what every first-person shooter strives for: a good shotgun. The shotgun itself is basic in appearance, but feels great to fire. It's likely the combination of actually turning the shotgun in 3D space that makes it feel so great. Plus the ragdoll physics of the enemies. You also got grenades that can be thrown or rolled with a nunchuck, which is, you guessed it, more of a pain to use than it actually needs to be. But I make sure to use them whenever I can, since I just love those ragdoll physics. Finally, the last gun mechanic worth bringing up: freezing time and pinpointing the areas you want to shoot. Like bullet time, but better. So long as this meter isn't empty, which is easy enough to fill. All it takes is shooting guys down. The best part about this is not only can you get easy kills by just selecting the enemy's noggins, but even better is if you point at their guns, they'll become disarmed and instantly surrender, so long as you physically motion them to do so. Later on, the game highlights leaders of some of the waves of enemies that come at you. Make them alone surrender, and you get the satisfying clang of every single enemy dropping their gun simultaneously. I seriously abuse this mechanic all the time. Upon first seeing the reveal of the Wii and its Wii Remote motion controls, the first idea that sprung into almost everyone's mind was the most obvious one: using the Wii Remote as a sword, or a lightsaber. Ubisoft looked to capitalize on its collective wish by having sword fighting be a primary element of Redsteel. However, in practice, the swordplay doesn't feel quite as you would expect. That is, a true representation of your controller, and in turn your hand's movements. This is because the Wii Remote's motion sensing capabilities isn't true one-to-one motion. It only has 3 degrees of motion. This means the controller only senses movement along 3 axes: tilt up, tilt down, tilt left right, and turn left right. On top of that, it only uses an accelerometer as opposed to a gyroscope. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of the tech, but basically, accelerometers alone are far less accurate in this use case compared to a gyroscope, which still works great in games with simpler motions like Wii Sports. Gyroscopes wouldn't be implemented into the Wii Remote until a few years later with the Wii Motion Plus. Due to this hardware limitation, it means you can't just swing your sword willy-nilly as the Jedi Master you always knew you were. Instead, the game just takes your basic movements and translates them into an attack on screen. It's more akin to a button press than actually replicating your movements, if that makes sense. Except you're swinging the Wii remote instead of pressing a button. Of course, that doesn't mean 14-year-old me wasn't hyped as hell. Being inspired by the original advertisement of the game, I make sure to physically stand up every time I encounter a sword fight, and keep sword movements on long motions. I ain't some grandma here. Make me work. Actually, I shouldn't discriminate. Grandmas are out here to this day playing Wii bowling. Swing with the Wii remote, block by quickly lifting the nunchuck, which actually feels quite satisfying when it works, and dodge using the C button, plus moving the analog stick left or right. These fights are usually a breeze, especially with some of the more advanced moves you unlock later, but there are a few tough opponents throughout the campaign who will give you some trouble. The best way I can describe how these fights feel is kind of like Punch-Out with swords, and less obvious patterns. Beat your opponent, and you'll have the option of sparing him or knocking his ass out. There's no reward for knocking a dude out at any point, whereas sparing them earns you respects. Your respects don't come into play until a bit later, although it's never made too apparent what their actual value is. But you may as well spare everyone. Plus it feels cooler. Shaking the nunchuck to put your sword away gives the illusion you are actually mimicking what's happening on screen. It's a safe bet that most people didn't play beyond the first couple opening levels, maybe due to fighting with the controls or being underwhelmed by the game's first impression. But if you dig deep, or if you have nothing else to play with your new Wii, there's some real thought put into the game's 16 distinct levels. You just need to put in the work. Redsteel even has hub worlds, something I certainly did not expect from this game. There's Otori's, where you'll train your sword fighting skills and learn new moves. And Harry's Club, where you can acquire new guns to your armory, along with selecting specific missions later. And of course, some of the story beats play throughout these areas. Some of the more imaginative sequences of the game I'd like to highlight. There's these themed massage parlor rooms, with cameras throughout alluding to some X-rated content being made here. Nothing too crazy, but just fun to look at and breaks up the monotony. It shows me that there are at least real people working on this game. Yep, this is a studio of sorts. A sauna section. Love a good fight in a sauna. Something just visually pleasing about it, isn't there? All these dudes got extra space in their towels for a big ass gun. Murderer? Wow, that really made me think. Last of Us Part 2 has nothing on Redsteel. Take a seat, steamy man. A shootout during a car wash. Riding this trash collector. Right into the furnace. Riding this conveyor belt in this factory level. I'm just a box. The fish-filled harbor district. The financial district. I like how in this one Ubisoft made sure to show their stocks were up. The neon-infused geisha district. All of these stages are much more fun and visually appealing than the initial opening segments. But most importantly, the game district, where we not only get treated to the fun sights and sounds of exploding pachinko machines, but also a level so obscure and out of left field that it's almost worth making an entire separate video on. Okay, I gotta talk about this real quick. Here we are stuck in this log cabin, but wait, it's a set? Also, some man is communicating to us through a creepy rabbit.
Either you conquer the challenges or you die. You see, this is what they call a hunting game.
Now we're having a fight on a faux ski hill with exploding rabbits everywhere. These anime dolls are placed everywhere to throw you off as the enemies are dressed the same way. Suddenly, the lights are out. The game honestly has no right being this spooky at all. Get tricked by all these explosives, which are actually just harmless. Fight back up the ski hill. And now we're fighting Power Rangers? Or I guess since we're in Japan, Super Sentai? Take out the green and purple Rangers. Find the big ass key in one of these igloos. Space Mountain like roller coaster. I also really enjoy all these in-between sections where you see all the different parts of the set. Now we're shooting big ass eggs to find a key, and in all these eggs out comes a Dino Man. Yes, welcome to Jurassic Park. Finally, we fight the Blue Ranger and the Red Ranger. And that's that. Something deeply disturbing about this cutscene as well. The story in Redsteel is a little generic with what I want to say are problematic accents.
You never do give up, do you, Scott? I knew I should have killed you the first time we met. What a pity, really.
I might be able to override some commands from my terminal and open an escape route for you. But you must buy me enough time to do it if someone comes.
I mean, some of them do sound like legitimate broken English from real people who have English as their second language. But knowing how voice acting works, probably not. Feels a bit dated. But the whole damn game is like this, so whatever. I love this part where your girlfriend's dad dies.
Scott, save me, you. Save her. You are the only hope we have left.
I literally wouldn't have known he died if it wasn't for that subtitle. The rest of the game plays out as so. The actual bad guy, Tokai, takes over Harry's, then you fight Harry for some reason. Ninjas with guns take over Otori's, gun ninjas. Otori fights alongside you, chase down Tokai.
Hear me, I'm dreaming. Could I just once trust my men to kill one gaijin when I ask?
Kill more ninjas, one last sword fight, and the end. This final sequence of levels actually drags on for a little longer than it needs to, and the ending is a little anticlimactic, with no post-game bonuses at all, but the journey wasn't all bad. You will find the occasional bug in this game. But in my opinion, they just add more value. Paralyze this man with fear. If all else fails to entertain you, you can always count on just blowing everything up and enjoying the hell of those very Gen 6 ragdoll physics.
No!
Did you really have to destroy absolutely everything?
So, did Redsteel live up to my expectations 15 years ago? Probably not entirely. The motion controls did immerse me at the time in a way no other game had. But really, this was just a precursor to what would build my enthusiasm for virtual reality, which today truly captures what I've been seeking to feel all those years back. The graphics are a mixed bag. Despite all its mystery, the Wii in reality is just a slightly more powerful GameCube. That doesn't mean with the right optimization and artistic direction, you can't create something visually pleasing. But with Redsteel, I feel like the game is attempting to make itself stand toe-to-toe with the Wii's contemporaries, the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, which results in a delightfully crusty graphical appearance. Unironically, I love the aesthetic of a game that is trying to look as good as it can on hardware that clearly cannot do it justice. Kind of like an ambitious Dreamcast game. There's just nothing like it. And for its time, having not played too many PS3 or 360 games yet, this wasn't half bad. Some sections have real care put into them, and it shows, while other areas leave something to be desired. One thing not to be underappreciated is how destructible the environment is. The game would likely be no different without it, but almost everything can be shot and destroyed in some way, from kitchenware to literal walls. I suppose it does make the shootouts feel that much more engaging when you're flailing your arm around trying to aim. I should also mention there is a split-screen multiplayer mode, but trust me, it's not worth getting into. Would I recommend this game today? Not really. But as an interesting cliff note in Nintendo's history, it's worth giving it a go from a basis of pure curiosity. Ubisoft would eventually address the shortcomings of the Redsteel in the soft rebooted sequel, Redsteel 2. The visuals are changed dramatically to work within the system's capabilities. The shooting controls are much more fine-tuned, while the sword controls are far more precise, thanks to Wii Motion Plus. Firearm and melee combat are beautifully intertwined instead of being just two separate instances, and the game seems to be running at a full 60 frames the entire time. It's better in every conceivable way. Game design alone. It's a good game, but in that, historically probably a less interesting game. Had this been the game that launched with the Wii, we'd probably be playing Redsteel 4 today. So what to do with Redsteel? Is there any value at all in it resurfacing somewhere? It's highly unlikely, but I can think of one place that would benefit from a reworked port of the game. Ubisoft would once again try an experimental game on the Wii successor, the Wii U. Stay tuned for part 2, where I'll be diving into what was the Wii U launch game, Zombie U.